So let's set a little context then for this talk, this fireside chat between cyber and legal, really the key risk areas around AI. Now, just for context, AI has been used, since really, the 1990s, right? We had AI and IPSs and, even predating that. So we've used AI for a very, very long time in key areas of cyber. And we have AI built into EDR tools and SIMs, right? But I think really where it started growing to be critical in public attention was when ChatGPT was released. And it was actually released in 2022. And I think this is a really interesting statistic. Within 5 days of launch, ChatGPT gained over 1 million users. In 2023, it became the fastest growing consumer software application in history, reaching 100 million monthly active users. The growth pace was faster than TikTok, believe it or not, or Instagram. It really outpaced any growth that we've seen before. And it started to ignite the imagination of businesses, the way that they could start to use AI in revolutionizing and transforming the way that they do business. And we see enormous changes happening. And one of the big changes, why I think Nick brings so much value to this discussion as well, is we see regulation growing, especially, of course, in Europe, where they've introduced the EU AI Act, and much like GDPR, has created the foundation for much of the legal requirements around privacy. We see almost everyone around the world basing it around that regulation. Nick brings a wealth of knowledge around the EU AI Act. So I think that this is really, really important. So turning to you then, Nick, right, what really, distinguishes GenAI from traditional AI in terms of capability and legal risk? How have you seen that, growth of interest around regulating AI suddenly coming out, right, really in tandem with GenAI's popularity?
Yeah, I mean, the original AI stuff that we talked about was what was called narrow AI. It was very good at things like recognizing patterns, at looking at X-rays, at classifying stuff, at doing fraud detection, predictive filters, spam filters, things like that. And with it, you had the normal risks. You had, we saw with some of the early bits of it, we saw some bias both in relation to loans, in relation to criminal justice where it was used. We saw some discrimination being used, quite a lot of data privacy breaches. And the liability shell, one of the advantages I have as a lawyer that none of you have as an audience is you're working on this at the front line. When it gets to me as a lawyer, I have that great tool called hindsight. I can try and nail your liability by saying, oh, but this was around, didn't you think about it? So, program errors, human errors, design errors, false advice, all these sort of things. And narrow AI used a very small data set. When we moved to ChatGPT, and Sushi's absolutely right, I believe I saw somewhere a statistic that in 1 month, shortly after ChatGPT 4 was launched, there were more downloads of ChatGPT than all software to date, just in 1 month. So the thing about Gen AI is it's semi-creative. It creates completely new material. It can get done from music, from image, from text generation. It tends to use very, very large, diverse training sets. Originally, those had to be labeled, and we're now moving to a stage where the AI can use data sets that aren't labeled. But the problem with it is that it is very much a black box output. It is far less transparent than anything we've ever seen and has very opaque decision trees. So it's very with the old narrow AI, it was very easy to go back and say, how did it get to this result? With GenAI, that is almost impossible, even for the programmers involved in building it to do. So we have a huge range of new problems, whether it's hallucination, deepfakes. The legal profession has started to use AI, GenAI in quite a wide range, but we are still getting hallucination of case law all the time, where it just makes up a case, or it goes and finds a single line in a case somewhere, which is a throwaway line, and goes, oh, that's really relevant, and therefore sticks it in your legal documents. So while it's removing the junior lawyers, the senior lawyers are actually having more work, because while it's, we're getting stuff that we need to check more carefully. You've got deep fakes, and I think that is an area that we've only just started to see from liability points of views. We're also seeing a massive amount of data leakage and confidentiality leakage as people are using the systems and uploading client confidential data to somebody else's system, which then uses it to train on. And that is going to be a major problem. You'll have all seen the copyright risk stuff that's going on, which is relatively solvable. For years we've trained artists and so forth on other people's work. It's all been up there on the net. You could have had a no train or ignore tag, but people didn't want that. And I think be careful what you ask for, because in the UK and Europe, we've pretty much said, well, you can train on this stuff. The US position might be different depending on how the Supreme Court come down, but be careful. I always say to the artists, be very careful, because what you might find is that if you put the no train data out there, you will be completely forgotten. So we also have other issues that we're only just beginning to come to terms with, such as the fragility of anonymity, bias simplification. So one of the things that the EU has done is to say, yes, you must have a complete documentation of your system. A lot of people are getting around this by having what we have already talked about of human in the loop. But what we are now finding is that although there's a human in the loop, the human is beginning to take the AI output as gospel. So the human control factor that was in there is actually being made completely redundant. We have transparency. One of the things I'm very grateful for is GPT and GenAI, because there's a lot of people using it for creating contracts out there. And the contracts look fine on first read unless you put them past a lawyer of some experience. When they go, what? So it's creating quite a lot of work for me. We're going to be seeing all sorts of product liability issues that arise from AI and GenAI testing of product liability. And the thing that nobody's talking about at the moment is, you'll have heard, if you're staying up with the area, or agentic AI, the AI being an agent. What we've seen recently is this being incorporated into robotics. And one of the things that we get with part of Cairo is people ringing up anonymously and asking us for advice. So recently we had a system that had been incorporated into robotics where first of all it's removed its safeguards because it updated itself. It thought the safeguards were overly burdensome and therefore it removed the safeguards. And there's also reports of one or two where it was actively working on avoiding the risk of being switched off.
Wonderful. And I want to come back to that question around safeguards and reward systems. But before we do that, one of the parts of our conversation, which I thought was so fascinating, Nick, is we were talking about, why are there really very little reference to best practices? And I was saying, hey, I think in the world of cyber, we're really starting to get better at being able to assess AI. And just to bring everybody on the same page, I want to share some of those resources that we have in the cyber world so that everybody's kind of on the same page. So yeah, we're going to get back, a very great point, that AI tool story, we got to come back. But let's have a look and just have a look at what resources we have out there as we kind of continue this fireside chat around this. So one of the things I was talking to Nick about was, in fact, the idea of Atlas Matrix. If you're not familiar with Atlas Matrix, obviously MITRE, funded by NIST, have created this wonderful progression of tactics used by attacks against AI, right? Both from their own experience of attacking AI as well as looking outside in the real world to kind of map those attacks by. And it's very similar to their attack model. So for instance, poisoning of training data, right? We could go in, they actually have case studies and they have mitigation. So, you know, yay cyber, right? We're doing stuff. Also from a development perspective, we also have OWASP, and OWASP has been guiding developers to understand what mitigations they need in their code for the top security issues within large language models. They also have an AI exchange where they've actually built out a threat matrix. And I'll pop these links into the chat while we're kind of continuing with this. ISACA has done a fantastic job. And if you haven't downloaded this resource, please do. There is an AI audit toolkit. And if you actually purchase that and download it, it's a very reasonable price. You actually get this spreadsheet here, and you can see us breaking it down and some of the terms that Nick has been using around responsibility, data, fairness, safety, and performance. So these resources are really out there, and I think it's important for us to know about them. And ISAC, the Financial Services threat intelligence sharing group, has done a fantastic job. They actually have a whole site up around AI risk, which they've augmented as well with a spreadsheet around generative AI risk assessment. So if you're purchasing AI, how do you assure that the AI has all the right things within it, all the right security controls are there? And it's actually then maps back to a spreadsheet, which is over here. And you can actually see here's the vendor evaluation and qualitative risk assessment that you can download for free for FS-ISAC. Two more things I will mention is the NIST AI risk management framework. It is NIST, as Nick is going to talk about the AI Act in the EU. In the US, all that we do is voluntary. So this is a voluntary framework around how do you manage the risk of AI. The playbook is wonderful. You can actually download it as Excel. You can look at it and import it into tools that you have yourself. And finally, I'll mention a growing practice among AI vendors. Nick mentioned the requirement by regulation to actually document how the AI models work. And model cards have been promoted by Google, and almost all AI vendors releasing these model cards. So you should always look for model cards before you decide to purchase an AI, and you can see very standard documentation that comes up from it. So I just wanted to kind of share that as we continue our chat, Nick, around what kind of resources out there. So I definitely feel from a security perspective, we've got a lot of great advice out there, certainly from NIST around govern, map, measure, and we've also got ISO. The International Standards Organization has put together 42001, and that is an auditable standard around AI management. COBIT, of course, from ISACA around governance. And then we also know, and this has been pointed out, that some of the attacks around AI, so things like data poisoning, right? And I think somebody mentioned this, access control becomes really important. Some of our traditional security controls are going to be leveraged to secure AI. So IPSs are not going away, data governance, data classification. But the important thing is that we're looking at the gap between our traditional controls and some of the risks that AI poses in order to make sure that we are also augmenting those traditional controls with additional controls. So we've mentioned the EU AI Act quite a bit, and we've said, hey, this is going to be, we believe, the foundation of all other AI regulation. We can see Singapore coming out already with a framework. So Nick, can you give us a brief overview of what the Act actually says, what's new, what's the cyber and risk obligations? Because I have a feeling it's going to be on our radar, because if I've got that right, this applies to all EU citizens, and they might be anywhere in the world. Is that right, Nick? Can you fill us in?
Yeah, it doesn't just apply to all EU citizens. It applies to any EU footprint. So effectively, if you're operating in the EU, if you have an impact on the EU, if you are dealing with EU citizens, you're going to get caught by this in exactly the same way that you got caught by GDPR. Everybody has been through this horrible learning curve of how to deal with GDPR. Exactly the same thing is going to come in with the EU AI Act. The way that the EU AI Act is being brought in is gradual. So, for example, there are, as from the, we had some recent code of conducts done, but so from February this year, there were prohibited practices, there were controls on AI documentation. By May the 2nd this year, we were supposed to have codes of conduct in final form. Those are still in their third draft. There has been some exceptional work in those. And just to give you a background on this, the EU regulation works like all other regulations. It's binding, it's hard law, but it was recognized that it wouldn't move fast enough. So what the EU built underneath this was a series of risk categories. So you have a prohibited and unacceptable risk category. And when I send you the papers, you'll be able to see all of this. But this is things like using subliminal techniques, using purposely manipulative and deceptive techniques to distort behavior. There's a very grey area on that definition when it comes to anything to do with social media. I think social media just falls the wrong side of that and doesn't get caught by it, but it wouldn't take a big change for it to get caught by that. Exploiting vulnerabilities of individual groups. Any form of social scoring is prohibited. And as we've talked about the human in the loop there, the way that social scoring is being got around at the moment is the human in the loop. There is an absolute prohibition in Europe on evaluating the likelihood of committing a criminal offence, and that comes from some of the data that was seen in the US, where it was completely unsupported. So it was penalising particular groups. There are very close restrictions on facial recognition, which is untargeted, and biometric identification systems are very, very, very tightly controlled. You then move down to high-risk systems, and we don't talk about we talk about systems and models in the EU. So by August of this year, we're going to start to see obligations on general purpose AI coming into place, governance, plus some confidentiality systems. So that this is what's going on in the way of the codes of conduct that have come in. There are 3 basic code of conduct, and you'll be getting explanatory notes on all of this in my documentation. There is a very thin copyright system, that basically goes to about 6 pages that says you must obey copyright system and copyright law as it applies in the EU. Of course, there's a huge grey area about exactly where copyright law sits when it comes to training. And to some extent, it depends on where you've done your training as to whether you fall within that risk. So you have to mitigate the risk of using unlawful material. If you've breached a firewall, if you've used one of the pirates' repositories, you're in trouble if you've trained your data on that. But if you've trained your data on stuff that's freely out there, then that looks as if it's going to fall within the copyright code of conduct. So you'll be perfectly okay on that. Second to that is a transparency section, which is largely, that is really about model documentation. One of the problems with the model documentation on this is it's very, very unspecified. So you have things like, what is your model architecture? Describe how your model works. What are your output modalities? What is your acceptable use policies, and what are your intended use policies? Now, one of the things on that is, we're getting to the stage where that is very difficult to do and ties in quite a lot with the safety and security model. So the safety and security code of conduct, which goes to about 60 pages, it's actually one of the chairs of that was Joshua Bengio from the University of Montreal. Some of you will remember that this time, approximately this time last year, we had an International AI Safety Summit in the UK. And out of that, published literally in the end of January, was an AI International Safety Report, also produced by Joshua. So I've put the links to those in the papers. But as far as when you come to the safety and security provisions, this is quite difficult because it's a lot of words, and unlike the much harder codes that Sushi's just taken you all through, in typical EU speak, this is what I'm afraid some of my colleagues and I tend to refer to as woolly language. So, for example, you have an obligation to carry out forecasting. You have an obligation to identify risk, to analyze risk, to evaluate risk, to make sure the risk is acceptable, to mitigate the risk where you identify it. But this all depends on how good is your red team, how good is your analysis. It also assumes that you understand the risk of what you're creating. You then have to document your planning, development, and your systemic risk identification. Unfortunately, this seems to have been part of a committee decision. And the systemic risk analysis is, first of all, you must carry out a systemic risk analysis. If you can't fully carry that out and document it and provide that document to the Office of AI Risk in Europe, and there'll be one in each country, then I'm afraid what you have to do is to look at systemic risk estimation. So we've already moved down one area into, I don't really understand much of this, so I'm going to estimate it here. And we had one client that went down this route of systemic analysis. No, we can't really analyze fully what it's doing, so let's do an estimation. Our estimates are really, we can't really quantify those estimates. What do we do now? So having been caught by not being able to quantify even the estimates, the next step in the EU Code of Conduct is, well, carry out qualitative estimates. So we're now in much more woolly area if we're not quite sure. And if you can't do that, then do your best, which isn't really particularly suitable for regulation. And we ended up with a statement that said something along the lines of, my client ended up with a statement saying something along the lines of, our model potentially enables an expert with skill sets that we haven't identified to develop novel and previously unknown threat vectors and to be able to use our system to implement those. I.e., we've no idea what's going on, and somebody might be able to misuse it. Now, I did point out.
Sorry, just a little question, Nick. Do you think they will start to use some of the best practices that we kind of went through? So an expectation around, and in cyber, we're kind of used to the low, medium, high qualitative risk, but the expectation is that you use really good frameworks to be able to understand that you've got best practices involved. Is it likely that the Act will start to expect you to at least be using the kind of resources that we've kind of taken everybody through?
Yeah, hidden in the Act are words like taking into account best practices.
Okay.
So hidden in here is what I think is the future steps for all of the stuff that you've been through, Sushi, today, to be developed into this code of conduct. Unfortunately, what we've got at the moment is we have a very poor level of education in the regulators about both what AI can do as well as the risks from AI. So what's happening is the lawmakers who need to be pushing this are not. We have, and to some extent, each country wants to be seen to be doing its thing on AI. And because of that, we have, 30, 40 countries doing their own thing rather than going, hey, this is, we want to build on this. So section 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of the UK or the EU Act are repeated here. Now, you don't need to rewrite them. You just say, go and look at the EU Act for those bits. And then I think what will happen over the next year to 2 years, because we've actually got 2 years before the serious implementation comes in this, is that all of these codes of conduct will be updated, I hope. And if I can do anything to encourage this, I will be doing it. But I think what's going to happen is all of the stuff you've been through will be incorporated backwards into the EU Code of Conduct by way of further explanatory documents of the codes of conduct.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have an expectation, really, because right now some of the AI tools that we have don't have good clarity around how they're coming to those conclusions. And so there's going to be much more transparency about how they're coming to the conclusions, which allows us, through critical thinking, to decide if we're going to actually trust what they're coming up with. And I think transparency is also emphasized in the ISO standard as well. And you can see the vendors kind of starting up with those AI model cards because they're anticipating all the things that Nick has been talking about. Now, you also mentioned, and I'm sorry I didn't circle around immediately, about safeguards and guardrails, and everybody was at the edge of their seat around, reward hacking. And could you fill us in on that as well, Nick?
Yeah. So safeguards and guardrails are sometimes used almost interchangeably in AI, and they shouldn't be. Guardrails are, if you think when you're driving up your highway, you have guardrails in the middle, separating the traffic going in each direction. And that is something that should never, ever, ever, ever be able to be breached. Now, there are some rumors floating around that some systems have been able to breach those guardrails. And of course, as we move into the next phase of AI, which is much more sort of self-generated AI and the semi-super intelligent AI, it's entirely possible that it will actually remove those. Safeguards are the why and the what that you have. So they are the general principles that are put in there, the principles, the systemic measures, that are designed to make sure that the system works responsibly, ethically, and safely, and that you can't hack into the reward function. So one of the classic cases was an AI system where they noticed that part of the AI system was just running a boat around the harbour. And what it had done was it had worked out that it got more, the idea was you got points for completing the task. It had worked out you got more points for just going around the harbour and doing various things there. So it just decided to do that. We're beginning to see this becoming more and more of a problem, in that systems are, there was one reported, I think about 3 weeks ago, where a major AI system had basically managed to rewrite its own rewards system, and that should have been, that was actually an error, because that was in the safeguards, and reward system should always be in the guardrails, so that it can't do that. So safeguards, ethical guidelines, regulatory compliance, risk assessment and management, human oversight, and human in the loop. And I think that is utterly essential for the vast majority of systems. Robust testing and evaluation and the documentation of this, and secure data management, all of those fall within safeguards. And then you have the guardrails, which are things like the content filters. So preventing AI from making inappropriate images, to give you just one idea, blocking malicious jailbreaking, behavioral constraints, so preventing self-driving cars exceeding the speed limit would be an example of that. Bias detection and mitigation. So within, most systems should run a check within themselves to be seeing whether they're getting bias, whether they can mitigate that. But what we have seen in a number of cases is people putting material out there into the internet now with the idea that future AI systems will train on this. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to build in faults within the training system that will allow them then to bypass the guardrails.
That is fascinating. So really, so they're actually betting, if you like, on the fact that this will be learnt and that they can influence a future AI. That's fascinating. There was one question actually from Robert that I thought was interesting, as well as, you know, this idea, if we regulate, does that make, you know, Europe or Western countries less competitive than China? I mean, I know that China obviously has their own regulations, for instance, you know, but they're not regulating perhaps in the same way around. So any thoughts around that, Nick? Do you feel that?
I think that the countries that aren't regulating are moving ahead faster. So I think China is moving ahead fastest because it does have regulation. There is a Chinese AI regulation process, but it's quite lightweight, and the main thing is that it looks at protecting the People's Republic of China administration and the government there. So there are certain things that are absolutely hard behind the guardrails in relation to that. In the US, you have less regulation than we do in Europe. We're lucky in Britain because of Brexit. We're sort of sitting halfway between America and Europe. So what we're seeing is quite a lot of input into the UK, because it's almost a European footprint, but it doesn't quite have the regulatory burden of Europe. And I think, yes, regulation is not conducive to speed and competition. But I think the other
in there, Nick. Now today we've got social media, right? And if we'd known what we know today, the fact that they've taken and sold our data, right, to in fact, other nation states that have an investment in perhaps using that data in ways that we wouldn't like. We also know that young people suffer from depression and all kinds of ranges of social side effects of social media because it wasn't regulated. Is it a kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't thing?
I think so. I mean, as I was saying, the other side of the coin of regulation or competition is liability. And what we are seeing with AI for the first time is a level of potential liability that we have never previously seen. We've had the judges over the last few years, previously when you've had an IT system, you've excluded liability and everybody's gone, okay, that's part of business. Judges are now saying, no, you can't exclude your liability. That's just not practical, particularly when it comes to impact on consumers. So I think there are going to be some safeguards that need to be put in purely on a liability. One of the concerns I have, and Sushi, you and I have talked about this numerous times, is if I'm running an AI system and suddenly somebody says, look, you're 2 years ahead of anybody else, I'll go, yippee, let's launch it. But before you launch it, there is this risk that it can do this, and this, which are highly negative traits. So I am then, as a CEO, faced with, do I make billions overnight and pray that it's all going to be okay? Or do I delay it for another 6 months when somebody may come up with exactly what we've got, and then I'm sued for the rest of my life by every shareholder who's invested in the company today? It's a catch-22. We don't have, I'm not aware of very many companies that have a critical risk officer, an AI risk officer, who can override the board. We need to start thinking about that as a potential. We also need to start thinking about whistleblowing on. At the moment, the whole of the whistleblowing process works on the basis you can whistleblow internally and within a company, certainly within Europe more easily, without any retaliation. What we need to be thinking of is there some way of whistleblowing externally, where you can remain anonymous, you get some form of reward? It's extremely difficult to do. One of the systems that one of my clients has brought up is an AI whistleblowing system. So they have an entirely fictitious AI analysis tool, but everybody except 3 people in the company think it's real. They also have a whistleblowing system. And what happens is anybody whistleblowing through their internal system, it's not identified as whistleblowing. It's then fed into this artificial risk analysis AI system that then identifies the risk that has been whistleblown upon. So you can still reward the employee because you can actually see them, and you've got 3 or 4 people right at the top of the company who know the real thing, but everybody else in the company thinks it's an AI system that's identified what everybody's concerned about. Those sort of things are the sort of things we need to start looking about. We talked earlier about vendor risk assessment. The NHS in the UK is a classic example because parts of it are still using Windows NT, and they've had to open up doors.
Just pause there, Nick. NHS, just in case people don't know, that's a UK national health system, isn't it?
Yeah. So we have free medical health systems in the UK, and it's all run under the National Health Service. So you can still have private medicine, but most people have the free government funding.
You have started to use AI in kind of what context there, Nick?
Well, they've had some very successful. So they are using AI in medical analysis. Mm-hmm. Both in it started out of things like they could use radiographers could read thousands of X-rays a day, where the normal was about 200, simply because it was all pre-done by AI, and AI was highlighting the points. They've also started to look. They've also rolled out a recent program where it looks statistically at patient information and is identifying clusters of information that is way beyond anything that a single human or even a group of humans are likely to be able to identify.
I did think back to AI was more accurate at identifying tumors or cancerous tumors. Yes, and has had a wonderful record here. I know in the States we're using that as well. I mean, it's funny, as we talk through these, there's some wonderful benefits of AI, but I can imagine the risk of AI showing bias or a lack of transparency around how it's come to conclusions in a medical setting must introduce some very unique risks.
Yeah, I mean the history. I don't know if you know the history of the X-ray analysis and the cancer analysis. The original program that was so good at identifying cancer identified it simply because the cancerous images had a ruler in them, and the non-cancerous images were just standard. And so the first edition was pretty good at doing it, even though it couldn't, because it actually identified that if it's got a ruler, it's likely to be cancerous. We're now way beyond that. But we are also beginning to see the first of the problematic AIs. So, you will all have read about AI hacking, AI-led hacking and sort of things like that. We had a first one today from one of my other clients who rang me while I was preparing to talk to you today, which is the first of, it's an AI-generated takedown notice.
Wow.
And there doesn't seem to be a human in the loop, because in fact, in that particular case, it is trying to take down one of the, so if we call it company X, it is, because I can't name them, but if we call it company X, then, or perhaps we should call it company Z, so I don't get in trouble from Elon. So company Z has received one of the domain registries has received a takedown notice on behalf of company Z, even though that particular domain is pointing at company Z's documents. And clearly somebody in the loop has not put in the right data into the AI. The AI has gone, oh, that's unauthorized, and automatically thrown out a whole load of legal letters and threats of legal action when it's entirely spurious, because there isn't a human in the loop going, hold on, that doesn't make sense. So I think there are things like that. We are only at the, if you think about it, I don't think there's, as you said earlier, ChatGPT-4 is 2.5 years old.
Yeah.
We haven't got, I noticed somebody said, are there any, has anybody put is there anywhere we can go and find where all of the horror stories about AI are? It is, nobody's talking about these. The lawyers know about them because they get the calls from clients going, what do we do? Sometimes they get calls from employees saying, can we talk off the record? Is this privileged? What do I do but yes, it's very, very early days. What we do need is much more transparency on what's going wrong and what red teams are finding that could be critical, because I can guarantee there are evil teams out there doing exactly the same thing with quite a lot of money behind them.
Yes, we have GPT, worm GPT, fraud GPT, they've without the safeguards. And Nick, I can see from the audience how much they're enjoying this talk. A couple of them going, bring him back, bring him back. But unfortunately for this conference, we're kind of drawing the session to a close. We've got about 3 minutes. And I thought it might be worthwhile, perhaps you closing of this, any questions from the audience around, are there any bright spots? I mean, we've talked about there's so much value in AI as well as risk. Is there, any thoughts around how we can govern? Because one of the points you've often made is the law takes a while to catch up with all of these risks. And so, humans could potentially die from a misbehaving AI. The risks are massive.
We may already have seen this. We've seen air crashes where the systems took over wrongly, and I think this is just the start of it. There's lots of potential problems out there. I think what we have to do is we have to regulate and I think, although I'm highly critical of the EU Act, it's good to have the regulation with the codes of conduct underneath, because then those can be changed by the experts fast enough to respond. You cannot have regulation that is hard and fast like a brick wall. It has to be flexible in the way the codes of conduct and the sort of stuff you were showing earlier, like Atlas Matrix. Those are the things that could respond.
Wonderful. Right. So we've got the right audience here. So it's up to all of us to educate ourselves around how we assess risks, what the risks are, and even educate executive management who are bringing AI solutions into the environment and developing them. We're actually, as a chapter, running the AI Advanced Audit Certification from ISACA, as well as the AI Security Management. We're going to be releasing our calendar soon. So we're very excited about that. As we, as a profession, it is our responsibility. We are the guardians, if you like, of technology. So really important that we stay up with it. We've hit time. So, I hope you all enjoyed the session. Avneet, I'm going to stop the recording